What percent mixture or admixture do Dominicans have?
So the last study, I really follow the genetic studies that have been done over the years. Like whenever I come across a new study, I'll just collect it. I really like to see that progress and even how things have changed and been discovered. But the last study that was done, actually, I believe it was finalized in 2017, I believe. And what they found was that 39% of the Dominican population is European, and 49% of the Dominican population is African, and 4% of the population is indigenous, like pre Columbian, DNA. So that was, a very interesting find, especially, for people who wanted to insist on, you know, proving that, we don't have all this African heritage, and all of these things. So I think, those kind of studies and the conversations around them, I think they're very good. They're necessary. And, the other, awesome part about that is that when you have mixing, of people like that, you really don't know what you're going to get, which is why we look so many different ways. You know, you can look at somebody and assume, oh no, you're more a higher percentage European, and then it turns out it's like, no, this person has a higher percentage of African DNA, or indigenous, DNA. So you can't go by what people look like at all. You just, you can't go by that, especially when you're looking at populations of people of mixed, ancestry. But that was the last report that I saw in the studies that were done, and they were samples taken from all parts of the Dominican Republic, and these findings were discussed, by scientists and anthropologists. There was coverage in Dominican Republic done in Spanish, and I think I posted a video actually on my TikTok page a while back, actually showing and covering that exact information that could be verified, across other scholarly sources. But basically, yeah, that's the last findings that they had. And there was another study, which was very, I just want to mention this. I posted about it too. I thought it was, very telling, and it confirms historically what has happened with colonization. There was a study done, wow, I want to say back in like the early 2000s, and it was done by an anthropologist, Juan Rodriguez, a Dominican anthropologist, and historians Silvio Torres Salant and Frank Moya Pons. They're two, notable Dominican historians, and they, were involved in a discussion with this anthropologist, and it was held in, in Harvard. And it was published in the Harvard Gazette. And what they found with the studies, first of all, is confirmation once again that Taino ancestry, Taino blood still lives on the island. There was a time when, scientists said it was extinct. It didn't exist. It was annihilated, but that's not true. The study found that the Taino ancestry really survived in mitochondrial DNA, like through maternal lineages. When it came to paternal lineages, it was practically non-existent. And then you also saw that paternal lineages of European were like high 50s as far as a percentage. Um, and then maternal lineages, you see the highest percentage is African. So you understand the dynamic of how indigenous Taino men were wiped out, most likely through wars. They were murdered. And the surviving, their wives, they were taken. They could have been raped. They could have been forced into marriages because all of their men are gone. So you see that, story. You understand it when you look at the DNA. And then you also see how European men also in relationships with African women. So you see that, when you look at the maternal lineages of a lot of Dominicans, it always takes you back to an African woman. And that story is in the DNA. You can see it, but you also understand that it's a story that plays out in most all colonized nations. So it's a lot of people that want to make this big distinction. Oh, we don't share the story of African Americans and all the black women that were raped. These were all consensual relationships. We don't share that history. But when you study the DNA, it's alarming. You can put that story together because the same story is revealed when studies have been done on DNA of African Americans and other countries as well, where you see the dynamic of African and indigenous and European colonizers. So people try to romanticize, these relationships when there's a whole other history that's not talked about, or addressed. So, all of those things I really follow and I paid attention to. And I think more and more we're going to start to have more revelations that will bring a lot of clarity to people and force people to have more conversations, around that.
Very, very, very interesting. Thank you so much for educating us on that. A lot of stuff that I didn't even know myself. And speaking of DNA, have you taken your DNA test to see what your makeup is?
Nope, I'm waiting. I'm waiting purposely, but I'm looking to do it
Why are you saying
within
that?
probably the end of this year because I wanted to see people's reaction first. It was important for me to see how I identify myself versus how other people identify me without knowing my DNA, my makeup, right? How Dominicans would identify me, how other Latinos would identify me, how Black Americans would identify me. I really wanted to have all of that. I wanted to hear that, just to kind of show how people, judge based upon how we look, you know, and that was important for me to do first. I said, I'm going to hold off. But definitely before the end of the year, I'm going to do it. And when I do it, I'm going to publicize my results.
I can't wait. I can't wait to see it. I've never taken my DNA before. I'm African. And people wonder why I'm African Dominican. If you're wondering why they nickname me that, just go to my about section. It's all
Yes,
clear
I
there.
read it. I
Right.
love it. Yeah.
Thank you. And so yeah, I also plan to take my DNA eventually because people always assume that Africans are 100% one thing. But
Mm-hmm.
at this point, I think everybody has a little mixture of everything in them. That's what I believe. I don't
Yeah.
think anybody's 100% one thing.
Yeah.
So
No,
anyway,
it's very mixed world.
the way it's called, right? Which Dominican admixture of the three that you mentioned, do you think that Dominicans appreciate the most and why?
I think with that, it's you really have to look at the differences generationally because I've seen a shift definitely. And I think that's something to pay attention to. It's something to be acknowledged because I see a lot of there's different types of people, right? It's crazy to me still, and it's really sad that I see people in their 20s and their 30s that are like very, bold, ethnocentrist. They're Trujillistas, they are very much about preserving the Hispanic identity of Dominicans and really representing that. There are still people who are boldly anti-Haitian on a racial level, right? And it still happens. And I'm talking about people younger than me because it's like it's being passed down and it's been accepted. And people who just buy into these ideologies that are very racist and they try to um, say that it's patriotism, right? It's Dominican patriotism and all of these things. And then you have other people who, whether they're born and raised in Dominican Republic or born and raised in the U.S., that really embrace African culture, their African identity. Because the thing is, African culture has always been Dominican culture because that's what composes Dominican culture. It is a fusion of our African heritage and our Taino heritage, and you see some semblances and bits and pieces of Spaniard influences. And then there's also been influences of, Asian communities. There's a big Asian community also in the Dominican Republic and Arab communities. There's so many immigrants that started to come in and also contributed to that. But really, like the majority, when you look at just how Dominican culture came to be, it wouldn't be what it is without our African heritage. Even the way we speak, the phrasing, how we like cut up words, how we shorten them, the intonation of the phrasing. And when you listen to certain African dialects, especially from West Africa, which is where a lot of, the Africans that were enslaved, that's where they're coming from, you can hear those similarities. And that is the influence of our African ancestors on our language and on our um, idioms too, and how we relate to one another and how we talk about things. It's amazing to me, and you definitely see that. And you see that, of course, with our indigenous heritage as well, names of cities that are, Taino, they're from the Taino cities that were established. You hear those Arawak names, but definitely I think it's a matter of looking at generations, and even still the divide within generations. If you look at people from, say, my grandparents' generation, right, and even people from my mother was grew up in the 70s as a teenager, right, well, like, mid 60s, right, into 70s. That was a generation of people that were still very much affected by the Trujillo era and this idea of Dominicanness, right, of Dominicanidad, that was synonymous with celebrating our Hispanic heritage, where the phenotypic representation of our people couldn't be darker than, quote unquote, the Indio, right, the Indian colored person. That whole space mentally where darker people were marginalized and restricted to certain parts of the island, or certain, access was given or not given. But definitely you'll see the differences there when it comes to embracing Africanness. And you'll have people that will argue, how can you say we don't celebrate or embrace our African culture? What about música de palo? We love our música de palo. That's African. Our food is African. We celebrate African heritage every time we eat mango. We celebrate our African heritage every time we dance merengue and we play the drums. I'm like, that has never stopped anybody from being racist. I don't care how much mango I eat. It does not stop me from being racist if I'm a racist. I don't care how much música de palo I dance to. If I'm a racist, I'm going to be a racist. I mean, what's the difference between that and how white Americans will culturally appropriate black culture? You know, just because you get your hair braided and you get cornrows and you're a white girl doesn't mean you can't be racist against black people. So that whole argument to me is always like, come on, give me a break. That doesn't change anything. Like, so there's this
Right.
part of the reason we can do that, though, is just because we have owned these things. These things have become like, no, this is ours. Música de palo is ours. This is a Dominican thing. This is what we do in Dominican Republic. Merengue is ours. This is what we do. The drum is, that's our culture. When you feel that there's like this ownness, there's this ownership, it's like, no, this is just my culture. But you cannot say that you love and embrace African culture and because of all these practices in our customs and culture, but yet you're still anti-black in other areas of your life. You still subscribe to the pelo malo, bad hair, or good hair. You still think that you shouldn't marry a person that's too dark, or you still believe in bettering the race and things like that. It's things that you can't separate, so, and that's the issue that I find even now with people in my generation and younger. They want to present this argument that, oh, we celebrate, we love this about our Africanness, but because there's all these forms of normalized racism, normalized anti-blackness within the culture, they're not seeing, how even still that is actually a rejection of our African heritage. You can't separate these things. So, that when you look at that population of people that exists within Dominican community, I would say there's still levels of honesty that needs to be confronted. And for some people, they really just don't think it's a problem. They don't see a conflict. or they haven't been confronted with it to the point where it like sparks change or provokes them to let me have some deep thought about this. Maybe I do need to make a change here. And then you have other people who are just very much like, I love my African roots through and through. It's a total like embracing of it. I mean, I love to see how, people in Dominican Republic now, they have like salons dedicated to natural hair care. 20 years ago, would you see that? Never. It was unheard of. Like, women couldn't go to work with their natural hair. They would be sent home because they look unkept. Like, for the fact that that was even legal and there was no law to protect them. There was no discrimination law. And that's another problem. You have this group of Dominicans that like to argue, oh, we don't have no Jim Crow over here. Don't compare us to the experience of Black Americans. We didn't have those laws. It's the fact that there weren't laws in place that people were able to get away with so much. But discrimination and racism was happening for a very long time. It just wasn't codified. There was no law in place. People were being discriminated and abused for years, but there was nothing in place to protect them. So people began to just keep it to themselves, or they would be silent, or it was just accepted. It was normal. This is my condition in life. And sometimes, when you have people in your own family that love you, it's like, my grandmother loves me. My mother loves me. Who cares if she calls me La Prieta Fea? The ugly dark one, like a video that I just posted recently with, Eva Longoria. It's like, it's, how can I demonize, my mom for saying this? And it's like, you're not demonizing your mom or your grandmother, whoever it is. You're confronting them with, what you're saying to me is hurtful, or what you're saying to me is racist. You think it's harmless, but it comes from somewhere. So it's a lot of conversations that happen there. But again, it's definitely generational when it comes to embracing our African heritage, because there are Dominicans in DR that are very much, I mean, they even just embrace Black American music, back home, and having it being exposed to that before it's even come to the US. They have already embraced, all of this. And they embrace their own Africanness, they embrace their own Blackness. So to say that all Dominicans feel that way, that's not true, because there are differences. And it really depends on what school of thought people subscribe to. There's still people who really hold on to Trujillo's ideology. There are people, who really hold on to those things. And there's people who've broken out of that. And not because they came to the United States, like a lot of people like to say, oh, you're brainwashed because you're in the US. Not at all. There's people who live in Dominican Republic who are having conversations about racism. They're confronting it. They're having conversations about racism in education. They're having conversations about racism in the business sector. And they are born and raised Dominicans. So they don't have to be in the US to recognize it. It's in front of their face. So I think it's important to look at that, understanding, again, Dominicans are not a monolith. We do have issues that we need to work on across different levels, things that still need to be addressed. But there is so much beautiful work being done by people right there on the island right now to bring change to that.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much for, again, another powerful input on that topic and question.
Things have changed a lot. There's a lot of movements among people. If anything, I would say that where the rejection of African heritage exists the most, it's really in the thought process that people don't realize or want to be honest about. This is anti-Black. So if you want to look at it from a perspective of embracing our, music and dance and everything that's African, of course, Dominicans never have a problem embracing that. We've done that for years. It's when you start to confront people at the level of, well, do you recognize that this is normalized racism? Do you recognize this is normalized white supremacy? That's when you start to see really like who is where. And there's a movement of people that are very much about embracing that identity and really solidifying and taking back who we are as an Afro-Indigenous people, really, because, you know, we were colonized. And there's too much glory that's been given to colonizers, you know, over the years. I want to see more, though. I want to see more people doing that, you know. So I can't say that nobody does that. I can't say all Dominicans do that because it's not true. But I want to see more. There's too much defending things that are wrong instead of acknowledging and saying, yes, this is a problem. Let's work to solve it. So that I definitely will say, we need to have more people in Dominican community to really address those things that are just very like covert, they're subliminal, you know, or they're accepted. That is where the biggest problem is. It's the covert things, because they're just, you know, people accept them. You know, that if anything, I say that's what we need to target.
Interesting. No, I'm glad you spoke on that, because like me looking from outside, or a lot of us who are not in the Dominican community per se, it almost looks like Dominicans embrace and value their European side more than their African side.
Yeah, it's historical too, though. It's historically, you're absolutely correct, because that is what has been the norm in the Dominican Republic. And the way you see that is in how people look at what defines beauty, you know, what makes, you know, a person look presentable, or, you know, what kind of family you should be a part of, who you should be connected to. When you look at that part of it, you see there's still an anti-Blackness there that's not being addressed. People don't want to admit it. They don't want to confront it. So when you look at that, you see how evident it is. So I want to be clear. You're absolutely correct in that, because collectively, there is still this normalized, right, idea that's really, it's a white supremacist ideology still that people need to really confront. People are working within Dominican community to do that, but it's not as widespread as it should be. And what I would like is for it to be even more. But there are movements happening. It's starting. And it is, again, it's generational, you know, but you got to go deep with people, because that part of it is like, it's still a problem. And more people need to talk about it. And there's people that are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to be attacked. They don't want to be attacked. They don't want to be ostracized from the community. But it needs to happen. It definitely needs to change.
Thank you so much for making that clear.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And see you in the next video.